48 hours, 2 days, 116,640 seconds. That's all the time they had. And everyone in that quiet room knew it wasn't just a deadline, it was a countdown. Because by the time those 48 hours were over, the United States Army would either stabilize the situation or lose control of it completely. And here's what makes this story so disturbing. The decision they made wasn't panicked, wasn't desperate, wasn't reckless. It was calm, professional, textbook correct. And it quietly cost them everything. Before I explain what happened in those 48 hours, I need you to understand something that military historians don't talk about enough. This wasn't a single isolated incident. This was a pattern that appeared again and again in American command decisions during World War II. Different fronts, different units, different commanders, but the same logic, the same caution, the same outcome. And that matters because this pattern reveals something deeply uncomfortable about how wars are actually lost. Not through dramatic defeats on battlefields, not through incompetence or cowardice, but through calm, reasonable decisions made by experienced officers who believed they were doing exactly what responsibility demanded. March 19th, 1944, Allied Forces Headquarters, Caserta, Italy. The conference room was on the second floor of the Royal Palace, a Baroque building that had survived centuries of Italian politics and now served as the nerve center for American operations in the Mediterranean theater. The room smelled like cigarette smoke, coffee that had been reheated too many times, and the faint musty odor of old stone walls that no amount of military efficiency could eliminate. Temperature inside, 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, rain hammered against tall windows overlooking gardens that had once hosted Italian royalty and now housed American supply depots. Inside, 8 senior American officers sat around a mahogany table covered in maps, intelligence reports, and radio transcripts that had arrived over the past 12 hours. The maps showed the Gustav Line, the German defensive position that stretched across Italy from the Tyrrhenian Sea to the Adriatic. 160 kilometers of fortified mountains, rivers, and valleys that had stopped the Allied advance for 4 solid months. For 4 months, American, British, and Commonwealth forces had been trying to break through. For 4 months, they'd failed. Tens of thousands of casualties, minimal territorial gain. And now, new intelligence suggested the Germans might be repositioning units near Monte Cassino. Might be. That word mattered more than anyone in the room wanted to admit. Because the intelligence wasn't conclusive, it was fragmentary, contradictory. Some reports suggested German forces were consolidating for a major counterattack. Others indicated they were shifting troops to reinforce. Other sectors threatened by Allied advances elsewhere in Italy. Others downplayed the movement entirely, suggesting it was nothing more than routine rotation, standard practice for units that had been in continuous combat for months. And that uncertainty created the dilemma that would define the next 48 hours and quietly change the trajectory of the Italian campaign. Major General Jeffrey Keyes, commanding the Second Corps, spoke first. 49 years old, West Point graduate, veteran of North Africa and Sicily. His voice was steady, methodical, the voice of a man who'd learned that wars are won through careful planning, not heroic improvisation. We have 2 options. We push forward aggressively based on incomplete intelligence and risk exposing our flanks if the reports are wrong. Or we consolidate our positions, wait 48 hours for better reconnaissance, and maintain operational security while our intelligence assets develop a clearer picture. Around the table, heads nodded. This was the familiar calculation that dominated American military thinking in 1944. Speed versus safety. Initiative versus security. Risk versus restraint. And by that point in the war, American military doctrine heavily favored restraint, because the United States had learned painful lessons about overextension. In North Africa, at Kasserine Pass in February 1943, aggressive American advances had outrun supply lines and walked straight into a German ambush that cost 2,300 American casualties in 5 days. In Sicily, in July 1943, hasty attacks against prepared German positions had led to unnecessary losses that accomplished nothing except filling field hospitals. The American military was still adapting to large-scale modern warfare against an experienced professional enemy. Its commanders were disciplined, methodical, and increasingly confident. but they were also learning in real time, operating with incomplete intelligence, enormous political pressure from Washington, public pressure from American newspapers that published casualty lists, and the constant grinding awareness that every decision would be measured not only by its military outcome, but by the number of American lives it cost. And that awareness shaped everything that followed, because in American command culture in 1944, minimizing unnecessary casualties wasn't hesitation. It wasn't cowardice. It was professionalism. It was command responsibility. It was what separated professional officers from reckless gamblers. So, when Major General Keyes proposed a 48-hour operational pause to allow for better reconnaissance, improved intelligence confirmation, and coordinated planning, no one in that room objected. The plan was conservative, focused on holding ground, maintaining unit cohesion, avoiding overextension, protecting supply lines, keeping reserves available for contingencies. On paper, it solved the immediate problem perfectly. The maps looked orderly, supply lines appeared stable, command relationships remained intact. Intelligence assessments suggested the Germans would either hesitate, consolidate defensively, or at minimum, slow down enough for American reconnaissance to provide clearer information. And that assumption, that belief that the Germans would hesitate, mattered more than anyone in that room realized, because American commanders believed hesitation would buy them time. And time was the currency they thought they could afford to spend. They had 48 hours. They would use those hours to reduce uncertainty, to gather better intelligence, to position forces more securely, to minimize risk. The decision moved through the chain of command with almost no resistance, from corps level to army level to theater command, because no one was advocating a gamble. This wasn't recklessness disguised as aggression. This was doctrine. This was professionalism. This was exactly what experienced officers were trained to do when facing incomplete information and the potential for catastrophic mistakes. And that's why it felt so completely, utterly right. Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison, the 2nd Corps intelligence officer, stood and walked to the map board, 32 years old, Princeton graduate, former history professor who had enlisted after Pearl Harbor. He pointed to 3 marked locations along the Gustav Line. These are the areas where we've detected possible German movement. Movement, not confirmed redeployment. We have visual observation reports from forward positions. We have signals intelligence suggesting increased radio traffic. We have prisoner interrogations mentioning unit transfers. But nothing definitive. Nothing that tells us intent, scale, or timing. He paused, choosing his words carefully. If we advance now based on this intelligence and we're wrong about German intentions, we expose 2nd Corps to a potential envelopment. If we wait 48 hours, our reconnaissance aircraft can conduct systematic overflights. Our ground observers can establish better positions, and we can develop a complete intelligence picture. Around the table, more nods. This was sound reasoning, measured, responsible, professional, and it was about to become one of the most expensive decisions of the Italian campaign. But what the Americans couldn't fully see from their conference room in Caserta, from their maps and intelligence reports and careful professional analysis, was what was happening 17 kilometers away on the other side of the Gustav Line. In a farmhouse northeast of Monte Cassino, General Lieutenant Fridolin von Senger and Ederlin, commander of the German 14th Panzer Corps, was reading the exact same intelligence his forces had carefully allowed the Americans to collect. Fragmentary reports, contradictory information, suggestions of movement without clarity of purpose, and von Senger, who had commanded German forces in Italy for 8 months and had studied American operational patterns with the intensity of a scientist examining bacteria under a microscope, understood something the Americans didn't. American forces had just sent a signal, an unintentional signal, but a perfectly clear one. By choosing to pause, by choosing to consolidate, by choosing to wait for better intelligence before committing to action, the Americans had revealed 3 critical things. First, they were prioritizing force preservation over operational tempo. Second, they believed they had time to make careful decisions. Third, they would not act aggressively on incomplete information. And all 3 of those assumptions were exploitable. Von Senger had fought against American forces in North Africa. He'd watched them learn, watched them adapt, watched them become more cautious after early defeats. He knew they valued systematic planning. He knew they were risk-averse when facing uncertainty. He knew they would choose safety over speed almost every time the choice presented itself, and he'd designed his intelligence deception specifically to trigger that choice. So, during those same 48 hours that American commanders spent waiting for better intelligence, consolidating positions, and conducting methodical reconnaissance, German forces were doing something entirely different. They were moving, not dramatically, not obviously, not in ways that would trigger American alarm systems or cause panic in Allied headquarters, but methodically, carefully, with the precision of a watchmaker adjusting microscopic components, small unit adjustments that looked like routine rotation, supply repositioning that appeared logistical rather than tactical, communication network changes that seemed administrative, road repair work that could be innocent infrastructure maintenance. But every movement had a purpose. Every adjustment created a small advantage. Every change positioned German forces for something the Americans weren't expecting. Because von Senger didn't need to launch a dramatic counterattack that would draw immediate American response. He didn't need to mass forces for a major offensive that reconnaissance aircraft would spot instantly. He just needed to exploit the operational space the Americans had voluntarily created by choosing caution. And space, in warfare, is time converted into geography. The Americans had chosen to buy time by holding position. The Germans were using that time to reshape the battlefield, isolating American observation posts, cutting supply routes in ways that appeared coincidental, positioning artillery to cover approaches the Americans would need to use when they eventually advanced, creating interlocking fields of fire that didn't exist 48 hours earlier. And none of this happened suddenly. It unfolded gradually. A company moving here, a battery repositioning there, a roadblock established, a bridge prepared for demolition. Each action small enough to escape attention. But collectively, they were changing everything. And the Americans, focused on gathering better intelligence about German intentions, were missing the pattern entirely. 24 hours into the 48-hour pause, updated intelligence reports reached American headquarters at Caserta. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison reviewed them carefully, looking for signs of major German movements, indicators of attack preparation, evidence that the decision to pause had been wrong. He found none. No German positions had collapsed. No major troop concentrations had been detected. No supply buildups indicated offensive preparation. Radio traffic remained within normal parameters. Prisoner interrogations revealed nothing alarming. Visual reconnaissance reported routine activity. Everything appeared stable, and that false stability reinforced the original decision. Because early confirmation discourages reassessment. This is one of the most dangerous moments in any military campaign, when initial caution appears validated by the absence of disaster. Because the absence of disaster is not the same as the presence of opportunity, but it feels the same, especially when you're under enormous pressure, especially when you're responsible for thousands of lives. Especially when doctrine supports your choice and experienced officers agree with your reasoning. So, the 48-hour pause continued. American forces held their positions, maintained security protocols, conducted systematic reconnaissance, waited for the clearer intelligence picture they believed would emerge, and the Germans kept moving, still not attacking, just positioning, still not massing forces, just adjusting, still not triggering alarms, just changing small things that would matter enormously later. On the morning of March 20th, 36 hours into the pause, something small happened that nobody in American headquarters initially noticed. A German combat engineer unit completed repairs on a bridge across the Rapido River. The repairs looked routine. The bridge had been damaged by American artillery weeks earlier. Fixing it made sense. It was the kind of mundane logistics work that happens constantly in active combat zones. But that bridge now allowed German forces to move reserves between sectors twice as fast as before. And von Senger had been waiting for that bridge to be ready before implementing the second phase of his repositioning. That same morning, a German signals unit established a new radio relay station in the mountains overlooking the Liri Valley. From an American intelligence perspective, it looked administrative, better communications infrastructure, normal military housekeeping. But that relay station allowed German artillery observers to coordinate fire across a much wider area. And it did so using landlines that American signals intelligence couldn't intercept. By the afternoon of March 20th, 40 hours into the pause, 3 American forward observation posts reported minor German activity in their sectors, patrols, small unit movements, nothing coordinated, nothing alarming. Each report was logged, each was analyzed. None suggested a pattern, because the Americans were looking for evidence of a major German operation. Mass troop movements, artillery concentrations, supply buildups, the signatures of preparation for a large-scale attack. They weren't looking for a dozen small adjustments that had no apparent connection. And that's exactly why the adjustments worked. If you're watching this and you're starting to realize how easily situations can change without anyone noticing, I need you to do something right now. Hit that like button. Leave a comment telling me if you've ever made a decision that felt completely right at the time, but turned out to be exactly wrong. Because what happened next shows how quickly 48 hours of caution can turn into months of consequences. And I want to know if this pattern feels familiar to you, because it should, because it keeps happening, and understanding why matters more than you think. So, drop a comment, hit like, and let's continue, because the 48 hours are almost over, and the Americans are about to discover what those hours actually cost. By the morning of March 21st, the 48-hour pause was complete. American reconnaissance had been conducted, intelligence had been analyzed, reports had been compiled, and the conclusion reached by American commanders was exactly what they'd hoped for. The situation appeared stable. No major German offensive was imminent. The intelligence that had triggered the pause now seemed less threatening. Forward units reported normal activity. No indicators suggested immediate danger. The decision to pause had been validated. Major General Keyes convened another meeting. The same conference room, the same officers, the same maps, now updated with 48 hours of additional intelligence. He spoke with the confidence of a commander whose caution had been proven correct. Reconnaissance confirms no major German offensive preparation. Intelligence suggests the movements we detected were routine rotations and minor tactical adjustments. We can now proceed with planned operations from a position of improved security and better information. The recommendation is to resume offensive planning with revised timelines based on current intelligence. Around the table, agreement, relief even. The 48-hour pause had worked exactly as intended. It had reduced uncertainty without costing anything visible. No positions lost, no casualties from hasty decisions, no units caught out of position. From the American perspective, it had been a textbook example of professional command. Measured, responsible, correct. And that assessment was completely devastatingly wrong. Because what the Americans couldn't see from their conference room was that in those 48 hours, the operational situation had fundamentally changed, not through dramatic German attacks that would have appeared on maps and triggered alarms, but through quiet, methodical repositioning that had turned American advantages into vulnerabilities. The Americans were no longer shaping events. They were responding to them. The initiative, that invisible but crucial element that determines who controls the tempo and direction of operations, had shifted, not through American defeat, but through American caution. And reversing that shift would now require risks the Americans were no longer positioned to take. Because the German forces that had appeared routine and defensive 48 hours earlier were now positioned to contest every American advance. The bridge that had been repaired could bring reserves forward faster than American intelligence estimated. The relay station that had been established could coordinate defensive fires across sectors Americans thought were isolated. The small unit adjustments that had appeared disconnected were actually interlocking pieces of a defensive system that hadn't existed 2 days earlier. And none of it had required a dramatic German operation, just 48 hours of methodical work while the Americans waited for certainty. Over the following weeks, American forces resumed offensive operations along the Gustav Line, and they discovered, piece by piece, that the battlefield had changed. Advances that intelligence suggested would be feasible encountered unexpected resistance. Routes that appeared open were covered by newly positioned artillery. Attacks that should have succeeded stalled against defenses that shouldn't have been there. Nothing catastrophic. Nothing that triggered command-level alarms. Just a steady grinding increase in the cost of every operation. More time required, more ammunition expended, more casualties suffered, more resources consumed for less territorial gain. And when American commanders tried to analyze what had gone wrong, they found no single dramatic failure, just a situation that had somehow become more difficult. And tracing that difficulty back to its source led to an uncomfortable realization. The 48-hour pause had cost them operational momentum, and momentum once lost is extraordinarily difficult to regain. Because the enemy now understands your decision-making pattern. They know you'll choose caution over speed. They know you'll wait for certainty before acting. They know you value force preservation over operational tempo. And once they know that, they can exploit it, again and again and again. And this wasn't an isolated incident. The pattern repeated throughout the war. Different fronts, different commanders, different circumstances, but the same logic, the same caution, the same outcome. In Normandy after D-Day, American forces paused to consolidate gains rather than pushing inland aggressively, giving German forces time to organize defenses that cost thousands of additional casualties to overcome. In the Hürtgen Forest, American commanders chose systematic, methodical advances over rapid penetration, turning what could have been a quick breakthrough into a 4-month meat grinder. In the approach to the Rhine, careful planning and force preservation took priority over exploitation of German disorganization after the Bulge, extending the war by weeks. None of these decisions were wrong when they were made. They were professional, responsible, supported by doctrine and experience. They were exactly what commanders are supposed to do when facing uncertainty. But war doesn't reward intentions. War rewards outcomes. And in every case, caution gave the enemy exactly what they needed: time, space, predictability, and the ability to turn American strengths into American problems. What makes these moments so disturbing isn't that they represent failure. They don't. They represent something more unsettling. They show how professional, experienced, well-intentioned decision-makers can collectively produce outcomes nobody wanted through choices that individually made perfect sense. And they reveal an uncomfortable truth about modern warfare that most people never consider. Sometimes the safest choice in the moment becomes the most dangerous choice in hindsight. Sometimes waiting for certainty guarantees you'll act too late. Sometimes protecting what you have ensures you'll lose what you need. And recognizing those moments while you're in them, while the pressure is unbearable and the information is incomplete and the responsibility is crushing, is almost impossible. Because you can't see the future, you can only see the present. And in the present, caution looks like wisdom. In March 1944, American commanders in Italy looked at incomplete intelligence, uncertain situations, and the very real possibility of American casualties from hasty decisions. And they chose to wait 48 hours, 2 days, 116,640 seconds, to gather better information, to reduce uncertainty, to make the right choice. And they did make the right choice according to every standard of professional military decision-making that existed at the time. They did exactly what their training, their experience, their doctrine, and their responsibility demanded, and it cost them months of operational momentum, thousands of additional casualties, and a lesson that military institutions are still struggling to learn 80 years later. That sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is nothing. That sometimes uncertainty is less risky than delay. That sometimes the enemy isn't waiting for you to be ready. They're waiting for you to hesitate. And the moment you hesitate, you've told them everything they need to know. If this story changed how you think about decision-making under pressure, I need you to do 3 things right now. First, hit that subscribe button, because next week I'm covering an equally disturbing pattern from the Pacific Theater that shows this same logic playing out with even more devastating consequences. Second, leave a comment telling me whether you think these commanders made the right choice, because I genuinely want to know if you would have done something different with the same information they had. And third, share this video with someone who needs to understand that sometimes the most professional decision is the most dangerous one, because this pattern doesn't just happen in war, it happens in business, in politics, in life. Whenever people choose safety over initiative and discover too late that safety was an illusion. They had 48 hours, and they used them exactly the way professional officers are trained to use them, carefully, methodically, responsibly. And that choice quietly changed everything, because wars aren't always won by the side that makes the best decisions. Sometimes they're won by the side that makes decisions faster, And in March 1944, the Germans made their decisions in real time, while the Americans waited for better information. And by the time the 48 hours were over, the better information no longer mattered, because the situation it described no longer existed. And that is why this moment still matters today. Not because it was dramatic or heroic or catastrophic, but because it was quiet, professional, and deeply human. And it shows that sometimes the most shocking decisions aren't the reckless ones. They're the careful ones, the measured ones, the ones that feel completely right until the moment you realize they were completely wrong. They had 48 hours, and they made a decision that every military professional would have supported, and it cost them everything they were trying to protect. Thank you for watching. Thank you for staying with this story, even though it's uncomfortable. And thank you for understanding that the hardest lessons from history aren't about what people did wrong. They're about what people did right and why it didn't matter.